"The rancher found a girl in his chicken pen," she said. "I want revenge, not food." The day had been long, and Hank Reynolds was used to the quiet. The sun had already begun to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows over the ranch. The cattle had been fed, the horses had been tended to, and Hank, now a middle-aged rancher, was preparing to check the chicken pen one last time before heading back to the small cabin where he lived alone. There was nothing unusual about his routine. His life, in fact, had become a rhythm of hard work and solitude, and that was how he liked it. The ranch had been in his family for generations, but it had been a long time since it felt full of life. His wife Emily had passed away years ago, and his children had grown up and moved to the city, leaving him with just the land, the animals, and his memories. Hank wasn't lonely exactly. He had his work, his peace, and the familiar surroundings that gave him comfort. Yet there was something about the silence of the evening that made him feel the weight of those empty spaces, those parts of his life that seemed to be fading away. That evening, as Hank made his way toward the chicken pen, he heard a rustling sound that was unusual. At first, he thought it might be a rabbit or some other small animal foraging through the grass, but the noise seemed more deliberate. Something was wrong. Hank's boots crunched on the dry ground as he walked closer, the sound of his steps blending with the quiet of the evening. The chickens were restless, making soft clucking noises, and he knew they didn't often react that way unless something or someone was disturbing them. As Hank reached the edge of the pen, he peered over the wooden fence. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. There, huddled among the hay and feathers, was a girl. She was no older than 15, her hair messy and wild, her clothes torn and dirty. She looked out of place, as though she had fallen into this world from somewhere else entirely. She wasn't moving much, just sitting there, staring into the distance. Hank felt a knot tighten in his stomach. A girl alone, at night, in the middle of nowhere? It wasn't normal. For a moment, Hank stood still, unsure of what to do. The girl didn't look like she was in immediate danger, but the situation was unsettling. He called out to her softly, his voice carrying across the dimming light. "Hey there, you all right?" he asked, his tone a mixture of curiosity and concern. The girl didn't respond at first, but Hank could see her shoulders move, as if she was taking a breath. Then, slowly, she turned her head to look at him, and Hank felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine. Her eyes were sharp, almost too sharp, filled with a kind of intensity that felt out of place for someone her age. She didn't seem frightened, nor did she seem to recognize the danger of being in a stranger's yard. Instead, she stared at Hank for a long moment before speaking in a voice that was steady but cold. "I want revenge," she said, her words heavy with meaning. Hank blinked, not sure he had heard her correctly. Revenge? The girl, barely a child sitting in the middle of his chicken pen in the fading light of dusk, wanted revenge? His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. What was she talking about? Who had wronged her? And why come to his ranch? Without a word, Hank moved toward the gate of the pen. He opened it slowly, careful not to startle her. The girl didn't flinch or make any move to leave. She just sat there, her gaze fixed on the ground. Hank took another step closer, then another, until he was standing just a few feet away from her. The smell of the hay and the faint scent of chickens filled the air, but the girl didn't seem to notice. Her eyes were distant, as if she were lost in a world that only she could see. Hank, unsure of what to say next, cleared his throat. "You hungry?" "Oh, it's been a long day. I've got some food back at the house," he offered, trying to offer some sort of comfort. But she shook her head slowly, her eyes narrowing. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I don't want food." Hank frowned. What was it that this girl wanted then? He had seen plenty of troubled souls in his time, people looking for shelter, for help, for escape, but revenge? That was something he didn't often encounter. It wasn't a word that came lightly. It was a word that carried weight, and the girl had spoken it with such certainty that it left Hank uneasy. He wondered if she had been through something terrible, something that had turned her heart cold and filled her with this deep desire for vengeance. "What's your name, girl?" Hank asked, trying to keep his voice gentle. "Where are you from?" The girl didn't answer at first, her fingers tracing the edge of the chicken pan as if lost in thought. Finally, she looked up at Hank, her expression hardening. "Sarah," she said, her voice a little stronger now, as though she were finding her footing. "I'm running from someone. I'm running from someone." "Running from someone?" That didn't sound good. "Running from who, Sarah?" he asked, leaning in slightly. His heart was beginning to race, his instincts telling him that this was no ordinary situation. Her eyes flickered for a moment, a shadow crossing her face before she spoke again. But this time her voice was quieter, filled with an edge of pain. "My stepfather," she said almost in a whisper. "He's done things. Bad things. I can't go back. I won't go back." Hank felt a wave of sympathy wash over him, mixed with confusion. A stepfather? What had she been through? He had seen his fair share of difficult situations, but this was something different, something that tugged at his heart in a way he hadn't expected. "You don't have to worry about that here," Hank said softly, trying to reassure her. "You're safe." "Hey! You're not going back anywhere!" Sarah didn't seem to hear him. She was already lost in her thoughts again, her mind far away. "I'll get him," she muttered to herself, more to the air than to Hank. "He won't get away with it." Hank took a deep breath, unsure of how to proceed. There was so much he didn't understand, but one thing was clear. This girl, this young woman, wasn't asking for help in the way he was used to. She didn't need a place to stay, didn't need food, didn't need sympathy. She needed something darker, something Hank wasn't sure he was prepared for. But as he looked down at her, a sense of responsibility stirred inside him. He couldn't just leave her there, not like this. "You can stay here for the night," Hank said finally, breaking the silence. "We'll figure things out in the morning." Sarah's eyes lifted to meet his, and for the first time, Hank saw a flicker of something softer in them. "Thank you," she said quietly. "But it won't be over until I get him. I'll make him pay." Hank nodded, even though a part of him wasn't sure what he was agreeing to. He didn't know what kind of revenge Sarah was seeking, or what she was capable of. But one thing was for sure, he wasn't going to let her face it alone. The night stretched on as Hank led Sarah into the house, the weight of the situation pressing down on him more than he could understand. He had just met a girl, but already, her story was changing his world. The night was quieter than Hank had ever remembered. The wind had died down, leaving behind the usual rustling of the leaves and the soft crooning of crickets. Inside the small cabin, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded tightly in front of her, her eyes downcast. Hank had set up a modest meal, just some leftover stew and bread. But she hadn't touched it. She sat still and quiet, her face distant, as if she were miles away from the warm light of the room. Hank didn't press her. He had learned over the years that sometimes silence was more telling than words, and he had no intention of pushing her when she clearly wasn't ready. Instead, he leaned back against the wooden counter and watched her. Sarah had a look about her, something hardened, something that didn't quite belong in a girl her age. He had seen many hard lives, but hers seemed different. She didn't just want to survive. She wanted to settle something deeper, something more personal. After a long while, Sarah's voice broke the silence. He's not my real father," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Hank stayed quiet, not sure what she was about to say, but knowing this was a chance for her to speak, if only for a moment. She continued, the words coming out slowly, as if each one carried more weight than she was ready to bear. "My mom married him when I was young. He seemed nice at first. He would take us out, show us new things, buy me treats when I was little. But that didn't last long." Hank could see the struggle in her eyes, the way she tried to make sense of the past. He had heard stories before, stories of broken families and toxic relationships, but it was clear Sarah's experience had been much worse than most. "He wasn't the man he pretended to be," Sarah continued. "After a few years, he started getting angry, sometimes for no reason at all. It was like he had two faces. one for the world and one for us. The world saw a nice guy, but behind closed doors, she trailed off, shaking her head. Hank knew better than to ask her to say more. Sometimes it was enough just to listen. "I tried to leave," Sarah went on, her voice steadying as she looked up at Hank. "I ran away once, but he found me. He promised me he wouldn't hurt me again. He said he was sorry, but I knew it wasn't true. I was just a kid and he was a grown man. I didn't have a choice. I had nowhere to go." Her eyes, which had been fierce with determination earlier, softened for a moment as she looked down at the table. "I was too scared to fight him back. I didn't know how." Hank felt a tightness in his chest. No child should ever have to live like that. He had always tried to create a safe space for himself and his family, a place where the land and animals offered a sense of peace. But peace was a rare commodity in the world outside his little ranch, and Sarah's story was a reminder of how cruel life could be to those who didn't have a choice. "But something changed," Sarah continued, the corner of her mouth twitching slightly, as though she were remembering something she didn't want to forget. "I wasn't a kid anymore. I started seeing the cracks in his facade. I wasn't scared like I used to be. I started thinking about what he'd done to me and to my mom, and the anger started to grow." Hank remained silent, trying to process what she was saying. It was clear that Sarah was no longer the frightened girl she had been when she first arrived at his ranch. There was something in her eyes, a kind of hardened resolve, that made him realize that this wasn't just a story of survival. It was about something deeper, a need for justice, even if it meant doing things that would change her forever. "I planned my escape," Sarah said, her voice steady now. "I waited for the right moment, when I knew he'd be distracted. And when it came, I ran. I didn't care what happened after that. I didn't care where I went, as long as I was away from him." Hank listened intently. He couldn't imagine what it must have been like to live in fear for so long. For Sarah, the ranch had become more than just a place to hide. It had become a place of refuge, a place where she could begin to figure out what to do next. But he knew that wasn't enough. She had come here for something more, something that would lead her down a path she could never turn back from. "I didn't know where to go," Sarah added.
"But I knew one thing. I had to face him.
He wasn't going to stop until he found me, and I wasn't going to let him hurt anyone else. I didn't care if it meant... I didn't care what I had to do. I just wanted him to pay for what he did." Hank let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He didn't have the answers, and he certainly didn't know what to do next. But one thing was clear. Sarah wasn't just running from her past. She was running towards something. Revenge, she had called it. But Hank knew there was more to it than that. This wasn't just about vengeance. It was about reclaiming control, about standing up for herself after years of silence. "That's why you're here, isn't it?" Hank said softly, his voice filled with a kind of understanding. "You want justice. You want to settle the score. You want him to know that what he did to you wasn't okay." Sarah nodded, her expression hardening again. "He has to pay," she repeated, as if saying it out loud made it more real. "He has to." Hank stood in silence for a moment, thinking. He had lived a long time, seen many faces and met many people, but he had never encountered someone like Sarah. She was a young girl with the heart of a warrior, a girl who had been broken but was determined not to be defeated. He wasn't sure what he was getting himself into, but he knew that once you made a decision, there was no turning back.
"If you're going after him, you won't be alone," Hank said finally.
His voice was firm, and there was no question in his mind. He had already made up his mind. "I'll help you. We'll figure out a way to make this right." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of surprise and gratitude. For a moment, it seemed like she was going to speak, but she just nodded slowly. The weight of what they were about to do hung in the air, but neither of them said anything more. They didn't need to. They both knew what was coming. The rest of the night passed quietly. Hank stayed up late, his mind spinning with thoughts of what lay ahead. He had promised to help Sarah, but he didn't know exactly what that would look like. He didn't know how things would unfold or what the future held. But one thing was clear. Sarah was no longer a victim. She was someone who was taking control of her life, no matter what it took. Sarah woke up early the next morning, the light of dawn creeping through the small cabin's window. She hadn't slept much. Her thoughts had been racing, and every time she closed her eyes, she could see the face of the man she was running from. It had been so many years of fear and running, and now she had come to a place where she could finally confront him, make him answer for the things he had done. But even now she couldn't shake the fear, the uncertainty of what would happen next. Hank had already risen before her. The smell of coffee filled the air as he worked on the stove, the rhythmic clink of the coffee pot against the metal counter, blending with the sound of the wind outside. It was a simple, quiet morning, but for Sarah, it felt like the calm before a storm. When she entered the kitchen, Hank turned and gave her a nod. His eyes were steady, calm, but there was something else in his gaze, something that Sarah couldn't quite place. He was here to help, that much was clear, but he wasn't sure where this road would lead. Neither of them was. "Morning," Hank said as he handed her a cup of coffee. "I'll head into town today, see if I can find any more information. You can rest up here." Sarah shook her head. "I can't rest," she said, her voice firm. "I'm not running anymore. I need to know where he is." Hank regarded her for a moment, his brow furrowed. She had a point. It wasn't just about hiding. It was about finding the answer she needed to move forward. But this wasn't going to be easy. The man she was after had his own network of people. He wasn't just going to be sitting around waiting for her to find him. Hank knew there was no simple solution to this. "All right," Hank said finally. "I'll see what I can do. But I don't want you out there on your own. This isn't the kind of thing you can do alone." "I'm not alone," Sarah said, her voice steady. "Not anymore." He could see that there was no changing Sarah's mind. She was determined, and no amount of talking was going to change that. He couldn't help but admire her courage, but he also knew that courage alone wasn't enough. There were risks to everything they were doing, and both of them had to be ready for whatever came next. The day passed slowly. Hank went into town to gather information, while Sarah stayed behind at the ranch. She tried to keep herself busy working around the ranch, tending to the animals. Every task she did felt important, like it brought her one step closer to something. But what exactly, she couldn't say. She just knew she couldn't sit still. The waiting, the uncertainty, it was driving her mad. Around noon, Hank returned, his face grim. He had learned what he could, but it wasn't good news. Sarah's stepfather had been moving around, making it difficult to pin him down. He had a reputation in town. A dangerous one. People feared him, but they were too scared to speak out against him. Hank could tell that even the most reliable townsfolk were reluctant to talk, and Sarah's stepfather had allies who weren't shy about using intimidation. "We have to be careful," Hank said as he sat down at the kitchen table. "I know people who can help, but they won't do anything unless we know exactly what we're up against." "We need a plan." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. The anger she had carried for so long flared up again, sharper than ever. She wanted to just go after him, find him, and make him face what he had done. But Hank was right. They couldn't rush into this. They needed to know how to handle this carefully. She couldn't afford to make any mistakes, not when everything was on the line. Over the next few days, they worked together to put a plan in motion. Hank reached out to some old contacts, people who owed him favors and who knew the kinds of things that couldn't be found in public records. He learned that Sarah's stepfather had been seen in a nearby town, but no one could say exactly where. The trail was cold, and time was running out. "I don't care how long it takes," Sarah said one evening, her voice filled with determination. "I'll keep going until I find him. I'll never stop." Hank looked at her, his expression softening. He understood her drive. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming control of her life. Sarah wasn't just running from her past. She was running toward a future she had never thought she could have. Hank admired that about her. It was something he had lost long ago, that fire, to fight for what was right, to stand up for yourself no matter the odds. But Hank also knew that there was more to this than just finding Sarah's stepfather. This wasn't going to be a simple confrontation. It would take more than just a few words, more than just an angry exchange. Whatever happened, Hank knew they had to be prepared for what lay ahead. The world Sarah had grown up in wasn't a world that was forgiving, and it certainly wasn't a world where justice came easily. On the third day, they got the break they had been waiting for. Hank's contact had tracked down Sarah's stepfather to a small cabin on the outskirts of town. It was a secluded spot, the kind of place where people went to hide or lay low. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Hank knew that once they got there, they would have to act fast. They couldn't risk being seen, couldn't risk alerting anyone that they were coming. That night, Sarah barely slept. She knew that tomorrow would be the day. The day she faced him, the man who had controlled her life for so long, the man who had taken so much from her. The thought of it filled her with a mix of excitement and fear. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew that she couldn't back down now. It had taken everything inside her to get this far, and she wasn't about to let fear stop her now. The next morning they prepared. Hank packed the essentials, a few supplies, a flashlight, and a map. Sarah packed nothing but the determination in her heart. Together they rode out to the cabin where Sarah's stepfather was hiding, knowing that whatever happened next, they would have to face it head on. The sun was just beginning to rise as they reached the cabin. Hank turned to Sarah, his face serious but filled with an unspoken understanding. He knew how much this meant to her, and he knew that whatever happened, they would face it together. "You ready?" Hank asked, his voice low. Sarah looked out at the cabin, her fists clenched. "Ready as I'll ever be." Together they made their way to the cabin, the sound of their horses' hooves breaking the silence of the morning. Neither of them spoke as they neared the door. Sarah's heart raced, and Hank's mind was clear. This wasn't just about the past. It was about the future, about putting an end to the cycle of fear and control that had defined Sarah's life for so long. The door creaked as they approached, and Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that everything was about to change. She had come this far. There was no turning back now. The sun had just begun to set, casting a golden hue across the landscape as Hank and Sarah returned to the ranch. It was quieter now, the tension of the past few days slowly starting to ease. But the events that had unfolded were still fresh in their minds. They had done it. They had faced Sarah's stepfather and, for the first time in years, Sarah had been able to stand up for herself. But as they rode back, the weight of what had happened settled over them both. There was no going back to the way things had been before. The confrontation had changed everything, and both of them knew that the road ahead would never be the same. When they returned to the ranch, Hank could see the exhaustion on Sarah's face. It wasn't just physical fatigue, it was emotional. She had carried this burden for so long, and now, after everything, it was starting to sink in just how much she had gone through. But there was something else in her eyes now, something different. It was as if, in facing her past, she had also begun to reclaim her future. Hank dismounted from his horse and looked at Sarah, who was already making her way toward the cabin. "You did well today," he said quietly. His voice wasn't filled with praise, but with understanding. He knew how much it had taken for her to stand her ground, to face the man who had once ruled her life. But it wasn't just about the confrontation. It was about what Sarah had gained in that moment. She had taken control of her own story. Sarah didn't respond immediately. Instead, she walked into the cabin and sat down by the window, staring out at the vast, empty land. Hank could see that she wasn't just looking at the land outside. She was looking inward, reflecting on everything that had happened. The silence between them was comfortable now. Not awkward, but full of meaning. It was as if they both understood the depth of what Sarah had been through and what she had just overcome. After a few minutes, Sarah finally spoke. "I never thought it would feel like this," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I thought that once I got the revenge I'd feel different. But now, it's like there's nothing left to fight for." She paused, looking down at her hands. "I don't know what to do now." Hank sat down across from her, his weathered hands resting on the table. He understood what she was feeling. For so long, Sarah had been driven by anger and the need to make someone pay. But now that she had faced that part of her past, she was left with a space inside her that had been filled with rage for so long. It was a space that needed to heal, to be filled with something new. "You've been carrying that weight for a long time," Hank said softly. "It makes sense that now, when it's over, you don't know what comes next." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. "It's hard to let go of something you've held onto for so long, even when it's something that's been holding you back." She had been so focused on getting revenge, on making her stepfather pay for everything he had done, that she hadn't considered what would come after. She had fought so hard for so long, but now that the battle was over, she was left with a quiet she didn't know how to handle. "I guess I thought I would feel different, like something would change inside me once I did this," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I still feel empty." Hank studied her for a moment, then nodded. "It's not about what happens after the fight," he said. "It's about who you become in the process."
"You've already changed, Sarah."
You've taken control of your life, and that's something that no one can take away from you. The rest, well, that'll come with time. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes searching. "Do you think I'll ever be able to move on? Do you think I'll ever feel like myself again?" Hank smiled gently, a look of understanding in his eyes. "I think you will. It'll take time, but you're stronger now. You've faced the hardest part. The rest of your life is yours to build." Das. Sarah didn't say anything for a long time. She stared out the window again, watching the wind stir the leaves of the trees. It felt like everything had changed, but she wasn't sure what the next step was. The world seemed quieter now, like the noise of the past had faded away, and she was left with the stillness of the present. But somehow it felt different this time. It didn't feel like the quiet before another storm. It felt like the calm after the storm, when everything had settled, and now she could breathe. Hank stood up and stretched, the ache in his muscles reminding him of how much work there was to be done on the ranch. "Why don't you get some rest?" he suggested. "Tomorrow we'll figure out the next steps. You don't have to carry this alone anymore." Sarah nodded, but she didn't move. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long while she wasn't afraid of it. She had come to terms with the past, with the things that had haunted her for so long, and now she was free to choose what came next. As the night deepened and the stars began to twinkle above, Sarah made her way to the small room in the back of the cabin. She lay down on the bed, the weight of the day slowly easing from her shoulders. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace that she had longed for, but never thought she would find. Hank, too, sat on the porch for a while, his eyes watching the night sky. It had been a long road for both of them, full of twists and turns, but they had made it through. The ranch, which had once felt empty and silent, now felt like a place where new beginnings could take root. They had both changed, but in different ways. For Hank, the journey had been about understanding what it meant to be there for someone, to offer help without expecting anything in return. For Sarah, it had been about taking back control of her life, to find the strength she needed to face the past and move forward. As the moon rose higher in the sky, Hank stood and went inside to get some sleep. The next day would bring more challenges, more questions, and more decisions. But for now, there was peace, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough.